Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. On Friday, April 12th of 1861, at 4:30 a.m., a unit of Confederate siege mortars under the command of Lieutenant Henry S. Farley opened fire on the Union's Fort Sumter. Those were the first shots of the First Battle of Fort Sumter and are considered to be the first shots of the U.S. Civil War. And while the Battle of Fort Sumter is pretty well known, the obscure last shots of the U.S. Civil War are nearly forgotten. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865, it did not end the Civil War. There were still several Confederate armies in the field. Many consider the last shots of the war to have been the shots fired in the last battle of the war, the Battle of Palmito Ranch near Brownsville, Texas on May 12th and 13th of 1865. But there is another record, because even after Palmito Ranch there was still an organized, unsurrendered Confederate unit in the field. And the last official shots of the Confederacy and the last time the Confederate flag was struck might not be where and when you expected. The story of the Confederate Raider CSS Shenandoah is little known, but well worth remembering. The Naval War is a relatively neglected part of Civil War history. While there were memorable events like the first battle between ironclad warships between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads, or the first successful sinking of an enemy ship by a submarine when H.L. Hunley sunk USS Housatonic, there were few large naval engagements. The Federal fleet was much larger than the Confederate fleet, making large-scale battle impractical. Much of the Naval War centered around the Union blockade of Confederate ports and Confederate efforts to circumvent that blockade. But there was another interesting part of the Naval War and the Civil War, as the Confederates went abroad to outfit commerce raiders, whose job it was to attack the Union economy and raise funds for the Confederacy by sinking or capturing Union merchant ships. A central figure in that effort was the Confederates' chief foreign agent in Great Britain, James Dunwoody Bullock, a former U.S. naval officer from Georgia, who happened to be future U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt's uncle. Creating a fleet of commerce raiders was not an easy task. While there was some sympathy for the Confederacy among the British government and the population, the nation was officially neutral, and it would have been a violation of that neutrality to outfit warships to attack the United States. Bullock was, however, clever and was able to procure and outfit a number of commerce raiders that were able to avoid Union attempts to intercept them. One of the most successful and arguably the most famous of these was CSS Alabama, which was built in secret in 1862 in Birkenhead, England, and outfitted as a warship in the Azores. During her 2 years at sea, Alabama claimed 65 Union ships, valued at more than $6 million, as prizes. But Alabama was caught and sunk by the Union sloop of war USS Kearsarge in June of 1864. With the loss of the Alabama, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, asked Bullock to outfit a replacement. Built in 1863 by Alexander Stephen and Sons of Glasgow, Scotland, the ship originally christened Sea King was an extreme clipper design with full rigging as well as a single steam engine. She had a displacement of 1,160 tons, was 230 feet long with a beam of 32.5 feet, and was built as a composite passenger cargo vessel for use in trade in the Far East and as an auxiliary troop transport. The ship made several voyages to the Far East, including delivering British troops to New Zealand. In October of 1864, Bullock secretly purchased the vessel for the Confederate Navy. The Union, however, had become wary of Bullock's methods, and in order to escape the Union ships, the Sea King had to be sent to sea without being outfitted. There she met another ship, masquerading as a British merchant vessel, who provided her with the guns and ammunition that would transform her into a ship of war. But the ship's new captain, James Waddell, was in a bind. Waddell was an experienced naval officer from North Carolina who had graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and had served in the Mexican War. But his new command, quickly rechristened CSS Shenandoah, was incomplete. While she now had guns, gun ports had not been cut. Even worse, they had not been provided with the gun tackles that are used on naval guns to manage the recoil. In other words, his guns were useless until he could procure the right equipment. Even worse, Shenandoah didn't really have a crew. Waddell had only been able to recruit a few men under the Union's watchful eye. And so with less than half a crew and only 2 guns outfitted so that they could actually be used, the CSS Shenandoah set out in search of Union merchant vessels. Shenandoah was able to capture a handful of merchant vessels in the Atlantic and off the coast of South America. And from there, Waddell was able to fully outfit his guns and recruit more crew from the captured ships. But Shenandoah still had problems. She was still undermanned, and the Union had become aware of her presence. The Union Navy was searching for her, notably the sloop of war USS Iroquois. What's more, the Shenandoah was having trouble with her propeller. Shenandoah set sail for Cape Town, South Africa, where Waddell hoped they could make repairs. But the captain of the Iroquois had anticipated the move, and Waddell, seeing that a Union warship was waiting, had to set sail for Melbourne, Australia, some 6,000 miles away, under full sail, since his propeller was no longer working. The gamble succeeded as the captain of the Iroquois guessed wrong on Shenandoah's next move and sailed to the island of Bali instead. Waddell and Shenandoah were able to convince the authorities in Melbourne to let them dock and repair their propeller. The U.S. consul in Melbourne did everything he could to oppose their stay, arguing that it violated neutrality. The consul's pleas became more pronounced when it became clear that Waddell was recruiting new crew amongst the Confederate sympathizing Australian population. That was a clear violation of neutrality. As the consul tried to get the Melbourne authorities to act, however, 45 new crew managed to sneak on board, and the Shenandoah slipped away. The failure of the authorities to act caused a minor scandal at the time, and would later cost the British Empire dearly. Waddell headed to the Pacific. While the Federal Navy assumed that he would head for the coast of Chile, they guessed wrong. Waddell was instead headed north to take on the New England whaling fleet. Although competition from the introduction of kerosene lamp oil had reduced the whaling fleet some since its peak in the 1850s, in 1865 the fleet still numbered over 150 ships and was a significant source of revenue for northern states. In early April, Waddell captured 4 whaling ships in a harbor off the island of Ponape in the South Pacific. He got whaling maps from the ships, showing him the location of the whaling fleet. He was free to attack, with no sign of the Federal Navy. What he did not know, and could not know at the time, was that the situation had changed at home. Even as Waddell set off north with his new maps, Lee was surrendering to Grant, and the war was in its final throes. Shenandoah was wildly successful, sailing into the Bering Strait and ravaging the whaling fleet, capturing some 29 vessels. The whaling crews were indignant as they knew the war to be over. Waddell, though, refused to believe, and the crews could produce no hard evidence. Even when faced with a months-old newspaper in late June recounting Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Waddell noted that in the paper, Confederate President Jefferson Davis had said the South was determined to fight on. In fact, Davis was already a prisoner, having been captured on May 10th. The Shenandoah destroyed 9 whalers on June 27th of 1865. Those are the last shots fired by an organized unit of the Confederate military. They occurred 48 days after Lee's surrender, and 25 days after the surrender of the Confederate Army west of the Mississippi under Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith, generally considered to be the end of the war. Surprisingly, the last shots of the Confederacy were fired in the North Pacific, in the Bering Strait. Shenandoah did not receive final confirmation of the end of the war until August 2nd, when they encountered the British bark Barracuda, which carried newspapers detailing the end of the war. But having found out the war was over, Waddell and Shenandoah were in a bind. They were afraid that if they surrendered now, they would be hung as pirates. They determined that the best course was to surrender where they had begun, in Liverpool, England. Pursued by the Federal Navy, the crew sailed around the Cape Horn, through the Atlantic, and returned to England. In doing so, they became the only ship of the Confederate Navy to circumnavigate the globe during the war. Once in Liverpool, they were required to fly a flag in order to get a pilot to the docks. They flew the ensign of the Confederate Navy and surrendered to a British ship, HMS Donegal. Thus, the last time the Confederate flag was officially flown and struck was not until November 6th of 1865. Shenandoah was at sea for a year and 17 days, and in that time sailed more than 58,000 miles. She cost the Union millions of dollars of damages in the ships captured or sunk, and captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, without losing a single crewman to combat, although 2 did die of disease. She never met a Federal warship in combat. She did great damage to the Pacific whaling fleet, although the continued demand for whalebone meant that whaling continued through the 19th century. And while the story of the Shenandoah is interesting in its own right, the legacy of the Shenandoah and her fellow Confederate raiders is somewhat surprising. In 1869, the United States filed suit against Great Britain, demanding damages, claiming that Britain's support for the Confederate raiders had violated neutrality. Among the evidence that was offered was the failure of the Melbourne authorities to act when Waddell was recruiting crew. In 1871, the dispute was taken to international arbitration with the Treaty of Washington and eventually settled for the sum of $15.5 million and a treaty of perpetual friendship between the United States and Great Britain. In setting the precedent for international arbitration, the so-called Alabama claims set the precedent for codifying international law, which then resulted in the Hague Convention in 1899, and eventually the League of Nations, the World Court, and the United Nations. A surprising legacy of the forgotten last shots of the U.S. Civil War. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy it, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I'll be happy to respond. And if you'd like 5 minutes more of forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.